Carla had always known that in her family, appearances mattered more than feelings. Her father, Claudio, was a strict and highly respected university professor, known for his speeches about discipline and unshakable moral values. Her mother, Helena, was the perfect wife, reserved, elegant, and dedicated to maintaining the family's pristine image. Then there was Renata, the ideal daughter, brilliant, obedient, the embodiment of everything Claudio and Helena wanted in a child. Carla, on the other hand, was different. She questioned rules, pushed boundaries, and refused to fit into the suffocating mold her parents had built. From a young age, she learned that any flaw or deviation from what they considered acceptable was treated as an unforgivable mistake. So when she got pregnant at 19, the carefully constructed world her family had built came crashing down. Her boyfriend, Marcos, was the first to turn his back on her. The same man who once claimed to love her now looked at her with cold detachment, as if the pregnancy were a problem to be erased. "You need to take care of this," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "We're not ready for this." But the worst reaction came from home. That evening, Carla gathered the courage to tell her family, hoping for at least a shred of understanding. Instead, her father slammed his fist against the table. "You've ruined your life. What will people think?" Her mother remained silent, eyes fixed on her plate. Renata, always aligned with their parents, simply looked at her with disgust. "You will have an abortion," Claudio declared, his tone leaving no room for debate. "I'll arrange everything. No one will ever know about this disgrace." His voice was sharp, final, as if her fate had already been decided for her. Carla felt the walls closing in around her. Her mother still hadn't said a word, her expression frozen in quiet complicity. Renata crossed her arms, staring at Carla as if she were a stranger. There was no sympathy, no hesitation, just judgment. And so, 2 days later, Carla found herself sitting in a cold, sterile clinic, her father pacing in the waiting room while she filled out paperwork. But then the doctor hesitated, scanning her medical records. "Carla," he said gently, lowering his voice, "with your medical history, I have to warn you. This procedure could make it very difficult for you to have children in the future." For the first time in her life, Carla said no to her father. "I'm not doing this." The words felt foreign on her tongue, but they were firm. Claudio's face twisted in rage. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," he hissed. But Carla had already made her decision. When they returned home, Claudio didn't even let her inside. Instead, he threw a packed suitcase at her feet. "If you refuse to follow the rules of this house, then you no longer have a home." His words were ice cold, but what hurt most was the silence from the others. Her mother didn't meet her eyes. Renata stood in the doorway, arms crossed, offering no protest, no goodbye. Carla waited, hoping, praying that someone would say something, but no one did. Carla stood outside, gripping the handle of her suitcase, the weight of rejection sinking in. She had nowhere to go. For the first time in her life, she was completely alone. Her mind raced through possibilities, friends, classmates, anyone who might take her in. But she knew the truth. Most of the people in her life were connected to her family, and no one would risk defying Claudio. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she hadn't thought of in years: Aunt Ligia. She was her mother's younger sister, the black sheep of the family, the one Claudio had always dismissed as a failure. Carla hesitated for only a moment before pressing call. "Ligia, it's me." "Carla," she said, her voice shaking. There was a pause on the other end, then a warm, familiar voice. "Carla? What's wrong?" Carla hesitated, then broke down. "I have nowhere to go." Ligia didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. "Come to me. You are not alone." That night, Carla took the last of her savings and boarded a bus to another city. Ligia was waiting for her at the station, arms open. She wasn't wealthy, didn't have a big house or luxury to offer. But when she hugged Carla, it was the first time in months that she felt safe. "We'll figure it out," Ligia whispered. and for the first time since the nightmare began. Carla believed it. Life with Ligia was not easy, but it was real. The small apartment was cramped and money was tight, but for the first time, Carla felt like she could breathe. She got a job at a bakery nearby, working early shifts to save up while she finished her pregnancy. Ligia helped her enroll in a night school program, refusing to let her give up on her education. It wasn't the life Carla had imagined for herself, but it was hers, and for the first time, she wasn't living under the weight of someone else's expectations. Months passed, and then one night, the contractions started. Carla had never felt such pain before, but when she held her son for the first time, everything else faded. Gabriel, that was the name she chose, a name that meant strength. Looking into his tiny face, she knew she had made the right decision. She had no regrets, no doubts. She would fight for this child, give him everything she never had, and unlike her parents, she would never make him feel like he had to be perfect to be loved. The years that followed were filled with struggle, but also with resilience. Carla juggled raising Gabriel, working, and finishing her studies. There were nights when exhaustion threatened to break her, but she kept going. Ligia was her rock, always reminding her that she was stronger than the circumstances forced upon her. Slowly, things started to change. She got a better job at a small accounting firm, moved into a tiny but cozy apartment of her own, and built a stable life for her son. Her parents never reached out. As far as they were concerned, she no longer existed. At first, the silence hurt. She imagined them living their perfect lives, pretending she had never been a part of it. But as time passed, she realized she no longer needed their approval. She had built something real, something her father's pristine reputation could never offer. And then, one evening, everything changed. Scrolling through social media, she came across a news article. Claudio had just announced his candidacy for city council. The headline praised him as a man of integrity and strong family values. Carla felt her stomach turn. The hypocrisy was sickening. Carla stared at the article, anger bubbling in her chest. Her father, the same man who had thrown her out without hesitation, was now preaching about family values. The comments were filled with praise, people calling him a role model, a defender of morality. It was almost laughable. She wanted to ignore it, to move on with her life, but something inside her refused to let it go. That was when Ligia, sitting beside her, exhaled sharply. "I think it's time you knew the whole truth," she said. Carla turned to her aunt, confused. "What do you mean?" Ligia hesitated, then reached for an old photo album from the bookshelf. She flipped through the pages until she landed on a picture Carla had never seen before. A newborn baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. "Before you and Renata were born," Ligia said. "Your parents had another child." Carla felt the room tilt slightly. "What?" Ligia nodded. "He was born with a medical condition. Nothing life-threatening, but enough that he needed expensive treatment. Your father didn't want the burden, so they gave him up, cut him out of their lives completely like he never existed." Carla felt like she couldn't breathe. A brother, a child erased from their family's history, just like she had been. "And my mother?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ligia sighed. She let it happen, just like she let everything else happen. The weight of those words settled heavily on Carla's chest. All these years, she had believed her parents' cruelty toward her was personal, that she was the only one who had been discarded for not fitting their perfect mold. But now she saw the truth. They had done it before. And now, decades later, her father was building his career on lies, pretending to be the very thing he had destroyed. Carla clenched her fists. "What happened to him, my brother?" Ligia gave her a sad smile. "I found him years ago. His name is Ricardo now. He was adopted by a good family. He grew up well, has his own business, a wife, kids." Carla's heart pounded. Her parents had abandoned him, erased him, just like they had tried to erase her. And now her father was standing on a stage, pretending to be a man of honor. "I need to meet him," Carla said, determination settling in her bones. "And then I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly who Claudio really is." It took months, But Carla found him. Ricardo, her brother. The first time they met, she could see traces of their family in him. The same sharp eyes, the same angular jawline as Claudio. But unlike their father, Ricardo's expression was warm, open. He had known he was adopted but had never understood why. When Carla told him the truth, his hands clenched into fists. "They threw you out, just like they threw me away," he muttered. "And now he stands in front of cameras talking about family values." The disgust in his voice mirrored Carla's own feelings. He had moved on with his life, built something for himself, but the idea that the man responsible for his abandonment was now being celebrated as a moral leader made his blood boil. "We have to stop him," Carla said. "Not for revenge, for the truth." Ricardo nodded. Together they planned. They wouldn't confront him in private. No, that would give him a chance to twist the narrative. They would do it publicly, where he couldn't hide behind his carefully curated image. And the perfect opportunity came in the form of a campaign event, a public Q&A session, where Claudio would be taking questions from citizens. Carla and Ricardo would be there, front and center. And this time, her father wouldn't be able to silence her. The event was packed. Supporters filled the venue, clapping enthusiastically as Claudio took the stage, smiling with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. Carla sat near the front, her hands steady, her pulse slow. Ricardo sat beside her, his expression unreadable. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, Carla raised her hand. Her father's eyes scanned the crowd, and when they landed on her, she saw the briefest flicker of recognition. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the same cold indifference she had known all her life. "Next question," he gestured toward her, oblivious to what was coming. She stood up, her voice clear and unwavering. "Mr. Claudio, you speak a lot about family values. Could you explain why you abandoned a son at birth and threw your pregnant daughter out of the house?" The room went silent. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. On stage, Claudio's practiced smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "I don't know what this woman is talking about," he said smoothly. "I have always been a man devoted to my family." That was when Ricardo stood. "Do you recognize me now, father?" His voice rang through the hall, sharp and cutting. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Claudio's face drained of color. Claudio opened his mouth, but no words came out. The weight of the moment crushed his usual composure. He glanced at Helena, who sat stiffly in the front row, her face pale. Renata, seated beside her, looked frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. The silence stretched unbearably. Then the whispers in the crowd grew louder. People were pulling out, their phones, recording, murmuring among themselves. Carla crossed her arms, her gaze locked onto her father's. "You don't recognize him," she pressed, "because you should. You erased him, just like you erased me." Claudio swallowed, gripping the podium as if it were the only thing holding him upright. This is a setup," he sputtered, his voice lacking its usual authority. "These people are trying to smear my reputation." But the damage was done. Ricardo stepped forward, pulling out a stack of papers. "Here's my birth certificate, the one with your name on it before you had it removed. The proof of who you really are." A reporter in the front row stood up, microphone raised. "Mr. Claudio, is this true?" Claudio turned to his wife, seeking support, but Helena looked away. Renata, always the loyal daughter, clenched her jaw but said nothing. He was alone now, just as he had left Carla and Ricardo alone all those years ago. The murmurs turned into a roar. Journalists bombarded, Claudio with questions, flashes from cameras illuminating his panicked face. He raised a trembling hand as if he could somehow silence the chaos. "This is nonsense, a desperate attempt to ruin my campaign." His voice cracked, and that was when Carla knew they had won. He wasn't the composed, untouchable figure he had always pretended to be. He was unraveling in front of everyone. Ricardo didn't need to say another word. The documents were enough. The internet had already exploded with the scandal, videos of the confrontation spreading like wildfire. Claudio's supporters, once so devoted, looked uncertain, some even disgusted. The campaign manager rushed onto the stage, whispering frantically in his ear. But it was too late. The damage was permanent. He had built his life on a foundation of lies, and now, in the span of minutes, it was crumbling beneath him. Claudio turned on his heel and stormed off the stage, shoving past his team as they scrambled to control the fallout. Zite, cameras followed him, capturing every second of his disgrace. Helena and Renata hurried after him, their faces tight with shame. Carla remained where she was, watching him flee, the weight of years of injustice finally lifting off her shoulders. She expected to feel triumphant, but instead, she just felt free. She had spent so much of her life carrying the pain of being abandoned, of being treated as disposable. But now, the truth was out, and Claudio, the man who had always cared more about his reputation than his own children, had finally lost everything he had built on deception. Later that night, the headlines were everywhere. Scandal Rock City Council candidate, hidden children, family abandonment, lies exposed. Carla sat in her apartment scrolling through the endless coverage. Her phone buzzed. Messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Even Renata had tried to call, but Carla ignored it. Whatever her sister had to say, it didn't matter anymore. Ricardo sat beside her, watching as their father's reputation burned. "It's over," he said. Carla nodded. "Yeah, it is." For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Days passed and Claudio's downfall only grew worse. Sponsors pulled their support, the university placed him on indefinite leave, and his political campaign collapsed entirely. He tried to salvage what he could, issuing a carefully worded statement about misunderstandings and family conflicts, but no one believed him. The damage was permanent. His name, once synonymous with prestige and morality, had become a cautionary tale of hypocrisy. Carla watched it all unfold, but she didn't feel the need to gloat. She had already moved on. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, her phone rang. She almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the best of her. The moment she answered, she recognized the voice. Marcos, Gabriel's father. "Carla," he started, his tone oddly cautious. I know it's been a long time, but I was thinking maybe I could meet Gabriel." Carla closed her eyes and let out a slow breath. After all these years, after abandoning her, after marrying Renata, now he wanted to play father? She chuckled, shaking her head. "You made your choice a long time ago, Marcos, and so did I." Before he could argue, she hung up. She turned back to Gabriel, who sat at the kitchen table, coloring. Her son, her greatest decision, her biggest victory. She had built a life without any of them, and she had never been happier. As Carla sat down across from Gabriel, she watched him, the soft hum of crayons against paper filling the quiet space. This was her life now. Simple, real, filled with love. No more pretending, no more fighting for a place in a family that had never truly accepted her. She had found her own people, built her own home, and that, more than anything, was her true victory. Meanwhile, Claudio's world continued to collapse. His university officially terminated his contract. His campaign was formally disbanded. Journalists uncovered more skeletons in his closet. Academic fraud, shady dealings, financial mismanagement. The once untouchable professor had become a disgrace. And as for Renata and Helena, they distanced themselves, desperately trying to salvage what remained of their social standing. But no amount of damage control could erase the truth. Claudio was finished. Weeks passed, and Carla barely thought about her father anymore. The storm had settled, and with it, the last remnants of her old life had finally faded away. One afternoon, as she was leaving work, she spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench outside the office building. Helena. Her mother looked smaller than Carla remembered, her usual poise replaced by exhaustion. For a moment, Carla considered walking past her, pretending she hadn't seen her. But something in her mother's expression made her pause. Helena looked up, eyes filled with something Carla had never seen in them before. Regret. "Carla," she said, softly, standing. She hesitated as if she didn't even know where to begin. Carla folded her arms. "Why are you here, Mom?" The word felt foreign on her tongue. Helena swallowed hard. I wanted to see you. And Gabriel." There it was. The same hesitation, the same avoidance of real accountability. Carla sighed. "You didn't want to see me when I was 19, when I was pregnant, when I had nowhere to go." She shook her head. "You stood by and let it happen. I don't owe you anything." Now, Helena's face crumpled, her carefully maintained composure finally breaking. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I failed you." Carla expected to feel satisfaction at those words, but she didn't. She just felt tired. For years, she had longed for her mother to acknowledge what had happened, to admit her silence had been just as cruel as Claudio's actions. And now that it was happening, it felt empty. Too little, too late. "I don't need an apology," Carla said, her voice steady. "I needed a mother back then. I needed you to fight for me, but you didn't." Helena looked away, ashamed. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of losing everything, of what people would say, of what your father would do if I opposed him." Carla let out a humorless laugh. "And you lost me instead." Helena's lips trembled. "I regret it every day." Carla studied her mother for a long moment. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe she wasn't. But it didn't change anything. "I've moved on," she said simply. "And I think you should too." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Helena standing there, alone. As Carla walked away, she felt no guilt, no second-guessing. For the first time in her life, she had chosen herself over the family that had never truly chosen her. Helena's regret, her pain, it was hers to carry now, just as Carla had carried the weight of abandonment for so many years. But not anymore. She wasn't that scared 19-year-old girl anymore. She had fought, she had survived, and she had won. That evening, as she tucked Gabriel into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mom, are we happy?" he asked innocently. Carla smiled, running her fingers gently through his hair. "Yeah, baby, we are." And for the first time she truly believed it. She had built a life of love, of truth, of real family. Not the one she had been born into, but the one she had created. And as she turned off the light and closed his door, she knew with absolute certainty she would never look back.